Hello, everybody. It's Chris Strabick, and this is Lloyd, who's curious about what's going on. He's a good guy. Even via video, he's pretty friendly. He shouldn't bite anybody. I'm here today to read to you from a little bit from The Way We Get By, which is my current novel. Very excited about it. I'm very excited to share a little bit with you and hopefully inspire you to purchase this book. So this happens about 2/3 of the way in which the steady bartender and central character of the novel recognizes that the owner is there to open for his shift, and a brief conversation that they have. When I pulled up in front of the bar that afternoon, Phil's SUV was already out front. I unlocked the side door and entered. Phil was mopping the floor. He looked up, confusion all over his expression. "What are you doing here?" "I've only worked Saturday afternoons for 18 months. I did the math in my head. 72 straight, give or take. Phil still looked confused. "I thought we decided I'd cover Saturday afternoon until we got someone new so you could have back-to-back days off." I had no recollection of any such discussion. "Are you sure that conversation didn't take place entirely in your head?" "Of course I'm not." He put the mop back into the bucket. "If I'm not supposed to be here, then you won't mind if I stop cleaning the floor for your shift." I shook my head and then made a show of looking at my watch. "I'm way ahead of schedule now." I sat in the closest booth and took out a cigarette. Phil sat across from me. "Mind if I join you?" I handed him a cigarette. "Since when are you smoking?" "Since this situation here is fucked." He grabbed my lighter and lit the cigarette. "This place is more trouble than it's worth." I waved him off. "This is an aberration. We'll get someone in here." Phil tapped the smoke in the ashtray on the table. He'd already cleaned them. "What about that friend of yours? Adam?" "Aaron?" I took a drag. "He's been banned for like a year. I haven't spoken with him in about as long. Last I heard, he was in Detroit, working the door at the Magic Stick." "He's banned? Why don't I remember this?" I shrugged. It was a long time coming. Ralph and Charlie were fed up with him. I think they let him overstay because they didn't want to offend me, but I didn't give a fuck at the end. "So what did he do?" I took another drag from my cigarette. "I wasn't here, but what Ralph told me is he was up to his usual bullshit, getting way too drunk and handsy on a couple of women. So Ralph tossed him, and he started freaking out about finishing his beer, moving like he was going to take it out of the bar with him. Ralph came around and went to grab it from him, and Aaron dumped it on him. Ralph said he was wrapping him up in a bear hug and threw him out onto the street." Phil shook his head. "You and Aaron go back?" I nodded. "Middle school." Phil's eyes went wide. "Speaking of going back, I almost forgot you were getting together with your ex last night. What happened?" I took a deep breath. I was sort of hoping Phil wouldn't ask. I hadn't fully digested the sequence of events the previous 18 hours. "I spent the night with her." I looked down at my shoes. "Why the long face? You've been hung up on this girl for how long?" "I don't want Megan anymore." "Obviously. She wouldn't have slept with you unless she sensed that. That's how it works." Phil took a last drag from the cigarette and put it out in the ashtray. "I want Molly." Phil shook his head. "You really are an idiot." "I know." Phil stood. "That's all right. It takes one to know one." I thought that comeback was a bit of an anachronism. "Sounds like you're talking about something else." He nodded. "I think I'm about done with this place." "What are you talking about?" Phil's face turned lightly red. "I'm talking about being too old for this shit. I've got a wife and a kid at home. I can't be covering a bunch of shifts in here, running around when I should be at home with my family." I'd never heard him say anything resembling this. I waved him off. "It's not the normal state of affairs. Ralph walked off with no warning. We'll find someone soon." He shook his head. It's more than that. He sat in the booth. 8 years of this, running from tax collectors, from ASCAP, BMI. I'm paying for my attorney's house up north. It's not worth it anymore. I wanted to point out he could run the business in a more legitimate fashion and bypass the attorney's fees, but it wasn't the time for that discussion. You're just frustrated, and I understand. You lost your most popular bartender with no warning. He even grabbed the cash out of the till on his way out. Straw and camel, Drill. Straw and camel. It's time to grow up. Time to admit Flint is fucked, and one little bar that brings the cool kids downtown isn't ever going to stem that tide. I don't know why I was trying to talk Phil off the ledge. If I was to be objective, he was absolutely right. Flint was fucked. It didn't matter how much the powers that be wanted to clean up downtown, because pretty facades and freshly paved streets wouldn't make any difference if there were no businesses. Maybe some adventurous younger people would continue to rehab houses in Carriagetown or move into one of the lofts in the Republic Bank building if they ever complete that project. That would be fine for a few years. Eventually, those same adventurous young people will get a little older and marry and have children, and there's zero chance of the same sense of adventure applying to sending their kids to Flint community schools. Talk was talk, and action was action. People would forever talk about the potential for places like Flint to bounce back and reinvent themselves after post-industrialization. The fact was that if it didn't happen in the previous decade, when things were swinging and cash was flowing, and even a place like Cleveland could be called a comeback city, then it was too fucking late for Flint. I don't blame you for getting down, Phil, at all. I took a last drag off my cigarette and put it out. What are you thinking about? He shrugged. Charlie's made entries. I'd sell him the inventory and lease the space, but I'd still own the building. I nodded. It was hard enough to work with Charlie. I wasn't sure I could work for him. Phil stood again. I'm just thinking out loud. Don't freak out just yet. I'm not freaking out. I looked at my watch. I do need to finish getting the place ready. I'll get out of your way. Phil pointed at my pack of parliaments. One for the road? Be my guest. He took one out of the pack and lit it with a deep drag. I'll leave you with one last thought. He pointed at me. Do you want a wife and kids? I nodded. Someday. Do you think Charlie does? Or Ralph? I knew Ralph's stance on having a family explicitly, and Charlie's was obvious from the way he treated nearly every woman who crossed his path. I guess not. Then don't be like Charlie and Ralph. Phil turned and walked out of the bar without saying goodbye. Again, that's just a little chunk of The Way We Get By. Chuck Klosterman generously called it a glimpse into the barroom 90s, what it was like to live as an overeducated and underemployed, I guess, hipster in those days. So if that's the sort of thing that you might enjoy reading during this extended break that we're all on, then maybe you'll enjoy The Way We Get By. Thanks for listening.